saying was the Gopal studies, and that's something that you spend time talking about at a few different points during the course of the book, and that it seems like you still think is relevant and needs to be part of the discussion today.
Oh yeah, I think that it was the most sustained, complex, and sophisticated astrological study so far, because he spent his whole life, and his wife was working with him, Michelle and Francois Gauquelin, and it was rigorous. I mean, that study holds up to any great scientific study. I mean, there's a lot of garbage out there that's done, and that allows the FDA to make a drug legal. But Gauquelin's is just as tough and tight, and more so than most others. And it's been challenged. If you interviewed Ken Irving, you know all about it. I mean,
over here.
The Tenacious Mars Effect is the name of the book.
So this is Brian
Pass. I guess I'm bringing it up because there was a lot of excitement surrounding Gauquelin's work and other attempts to do scientific studies of astrology like that, and kind of pick out one factor or a couple of factors in astrology and you try to test it scientifically. But I feel like the astrological in the 1980s and 1990s with some of those studies where, for different reasons, things were not going as well as they hoped. Sometimes, occasionally through like underhanded means, like some other replications of the Gauquelin studies that were withheld or swept under the rug initially. And especially starting in the 90s, there's been a lot of reflections in the community about why this was, attempts to explain it, and a sort of decline in enthusiasm, and questions especially about whether that was even an appropriate way to attempt to validate astrology, so that you get the work of people like, most notably Jeffrey Cornelius and his work, The Moment of Astrology, that tried to explain why scientific tests of that sort, statistical tests primarily, might always be doomed to failure, or might not be an appropriate way to attempt to study the phenomenon of astrology. But it seems like in your book that's something where you don't agree with that viewpoint, and things have gone over the past 3 decades, and you try to push back on that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him in the sense that reductionism in testing astrology, is, at least initially, it's not going to get the results. So it's going to look bad for astrology, because in astrology, you're testing a self-organizing system, and self-organizing systems, or emergent systems resist quantification. They're very hard to test. So, we're working with a difficult beast.
Oh, you don't know.
But I think there are some openings, and it depends on refinement. Like, for example, there was the NCGR suicide study. And so they got a lot of charts of suicides, people that committed suicide, and they tried to see what was common with them, and they tried everything. They threw the kitchen sink at it, Uranian astrology, everything, and they didn't really come up with anything that was statistically significant. Now, my take on that was that, there's different suicides for different reasons. And sure enough, when I was working on this book, I came across this paper that somebody wrote on a study of suicide ideation, like the correlation between suicide and what is generating the suicide showed some statistical significance with, one set of reasons rather than another. So, to me, I don't remember the details offhand right now, but, to me, that's like a lot of sciences. You have to start refining your sample set. Gauquelin got results because he didn't take all athletes. He took athletes that were good. And then he had to find some way of saying how they were good, so they had to have, scored in major competitions or be listed in books or whatever. And that was, checked by Earl and a number of others, and it worked. So that's called extreme sampling. And so you do have to do that. There are people that are doing it.
Yeah, so the point was that the phenomenon showed up in the charts of eminent athletes, not just any old athlete. But then there became a argument around what constitutes eminence and whether there's subjective issues in terms of deciding who's eminent versus not.
But that happens in doing any kind of social science. I mean, I don't think it's, astrology's subject matter is complex, but so is psychology's, because it's almost the same. And, psychology has all the institutions, and it's aligned itself with the medical field, so it's got that advantage. And so, they keep working on these personality inventories, and mostly they're self-created. They're the studies here. They have as hard a time of testing their subjects as astrologers, but they're not astrology. Astrology's
that sucked. I was hoping I could trick him, but he was way too strong. At least I'll end up being there, so it didn't really help. No, I have to go over again. That's annoying. Okay, give me a second, y'all. I just hate that. I have to go all the way back and redo all this BS. I sorry, we weren't listening, were we?
Because it interferes with fate and free will. Physicists don't like it. There's a lot of prejudice towards it. So astrologers,
That's not my
they
bag.
do 10 times as much work to get any kind of attention. Meanwhile, Gauquelin studies stands there. It's like a giant edifice in the field of astrology. It's a big building, and they don't want to look at it. Still goes on. There's still arguments pro and con, but I think it's pretty solid.
Right. I think I wrote down a sentence that you wrote at one point later in the book where you said, "It should be obvious by now that astrology does not lend itself to reductionism because it does not study easily reducible phenomena."
Yeah. Yeah, self-organizing systems are in motion. It's hard to you got to take out, you got to take one shot at it and take one piece of it. Well, like what I did with the weather. I explained it, traditionally Saturn and the weather. And you got to remember that the people that were, on the side here, the people that were doing astrometeorology are using the same techniques as the people that were making charts. Right?
Yeah, I mean, that gets into some complicated stuff though, in terms of weather prediction and things like that.
But they all... I was going to say, they all agreed Saturn was cold, dark, damp, not good. And I took one of those, qualities, and then I got daily temperature data. And I ran it again. In this case, as I mentioned before, the Sun-Saturn opposition, and lo and behold, I got a result that was pretty consistent. So that's reductionism applied to a system, but it doesn't have that much to do with free will, so it's not earth-shattering.
Yeah, well, and I was thinking, the Gauquelin studies are a better example of that to the extent that you're talking about isolating one factor, which is like Mars, and what sector of the chart it's in, essentially, and whether it's especially rising or culminating at the midheaven.
Yeah.
But you're focusing on just that one factor in isolation of everything else, which is hard because that's not usually how astrologers operate when looking at charts. But instead they're looking at the totality of the chart and how the alignments of the planets sort of alter the expression of different planets based on how each of the planets in the chart is aligned relative to each other.
Yeah, astrology is synthesis. You're blending things, and it's done intuitively like an artist does. That's why the practice of astrology is not a science, it's an art. But astrology is a subject, and it has a component, like other subjects do, that could be called theory and research, and they could be separate, or they could be working together, or whatever, but that could produce a science. That's what has happened with psychology.
Yeah, that's one of your primary contentions, is that you think that someday astrology will be validated as a science.
Yeah, they may not, people really didn't understand the mechanisms of evolution when Darwin, published You know, he knew that there was variation, but he didn't know how the variation was produced. His theory of evolution, you know, that came later. You know, ironically, it was coming at the same time Gregor Mendel was like working out inheritance with his studies on peas, but it really wasn't until another 50 years where that got integrated with evolution, and then it became neo-Darwinism. So, you know, similar things could happen with astrology. You can build up some model that works pretty well and then start filling in the details later as you get to it.
Yeah, but I would just, in terms of response to that last question, like that was kind of a non-yes. It's actually a much more strongly affirmative answer with personal view on that. I do strongly believe that astrology will be validated scientifically at some point, as opposed to him saying like astrologers such as Cornelius who say no, that's actually not going to happen because there's something about the intrinsic nature of astrology that makes that not possible.
Yeah, I don't agree with him at all. I mean, there's a lot. He says a lot of interesting things. You know, I read the book and I got a lot out of it, but I disagree. I think that, you know, calling it divination is easy and it solves the problem for the time being. But I think that there's a lot of reality to astrology. You can see it working, you know, and it's affecting other self-organizing systems like weather. And I'm going to test it myself. And, you know, Gauquelin tested natal astrology by noting, you know, significant correlations in the diurnal cycle of the planets, you know, which we call the houses in astrology. Of course, he called them Gauquelin sectors. He used 12, 18, and 36, or something like that, 24. He used different sectors, you know, depending on what the study was. But I think that as time goes on and astrology begins to build better institutions, or institutions in the first place, I mean, what do we have? A few schools and a few organizations? That's about it, right?
Yeah.
So maybe some billionaire will come along, you know, start something up. Who knows? I don't know. You know, and if you read carefully, I'm talking in terms of centuries, really. I'm not saying this is going to happen, you know, in the next 20 years, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, you actually have to spend the entire last chapter. It was an interesting contrast to early in the book you said about some of the diciness with making predictions, but you spend a large part of the last chapter actually making some predictions about the future trajectory of
Sorry, I turned off the light because I still feel like it's going to capture my audio, but I don't know why. It just seems like it is. But what is this? I have no idea. Like, Sage's will? Are we going to find that out? Maybe it's something we'll figure it out later. Or maybe it's something to do with, I don't know. It looks like it's a collectible. Interesting. Anyway, sorry. I was just doing that.
astrology and the astrological community, just based on your observations of what actually seemed like, when I was reading it, like a very interesting and perceptive set of observations about the astrological community and the type of people in it, and a sort of realistic projection, although sometimes idyllic or like best case scenario projection about where astrology could end up in the future and its place in society based on certain things that astrologers might do now.
Yeah, I'm not, you know, let me be clear and say I'm not making, and you know this, that I'm not making an astrological prediction about where astrology is going to be.
Right.
I'm just making, you know, some comments and observations, you know, maybe supported by some ideas that I've gotten from studying history. And I do see astrology as a legitimate subject that's about 300 or 400 years behind the other subjects. Maybe not quite that, maybe 300 is about right. And so it has not gone through its, you know...
Interesting he says 300 to 400, because what's interesting about this comic, and he may even iterate this because I haven't heard this part, but I'm just going to comment now before he says something that might sound like something else. But this is just a different thought, and maybe he won't talk about it, but Vedic astrology and other forms of astrology in the Eastern world have been developed for thousands of years. astrology, I've mentioned before, has not had that luxury due to colonialism and the crusades of Christianity and stuff, and just a mixture of a lot of other things, like, no hard proof from the science community, mostly put the nail to the coffin. But I did think about this that isn't really thought of. I think there's a general bias against things that are part of something that are not part of the logics behind the people who were the center of thought back in those days. Now, there's no proof of this. I have no documentary of this. I can't travel back in time, but this is just an observation based on the behaviors of human beings and just in general thinking about history and just in overall. So just take this as a grain of salt in a way, but unless there's some concrete proof where I can't really say for sure. But in my assumption is that I think a lot of things having to do with that, with astrology not having validity in the Westerns, due to the fact that it's, mostly ruled by the Western world, who were very much against anything that was othered to their own belief system that they themselves had determined was the truth. And so they themselves denounce anything feminine, anything gay, anything just non-Christian Abrahamic religion. And they were biased to what they thought was true based on what they found. And because of that, their focuses on those studies became central, and so thus they were allowed to develop. The thing is, back in the day, most people only studied or got validity when you got enough people kind of on board with that. And if you were rich and interested in these type of stuff, then yeah. Now, fate and also stuff was used for a lot of astrology. That they mentioned this before in the podcast, and I think that was what the Protestants didn't like, because fate was kind of more Catholic built in a sense, where we're fated for da. But what's funny is that they too kind of put themselves in some sort of fate ideal, but only with the afterlife, because they didn't want the idea of someone telling what to do, but they also wanted to tell people what to do. But Catholics were the same way, so they were just the other side of the snake coin that they all shared, both Catholics and Protestants. And it annoys the crap out of me when they separate themselves, when they're literally the same damn thing. Christians are the same damn thing. Don't let them fool you. Yes, they might interpret the Bible a bit differently, but it's the same damn thing. And they just have their own interpretation that they want to believe is true, get enough people to think and be on board with that, and thus I think that also put it out to astrology as well. And they mentioned this too, but it all kind of comes down to, biases that we've already shared and our ancestors shared too. There could be a lot of truths to this world that we will never know because, people weren't interested in learning, and it could have been the very thing that we needed to solve a certain puzzle. And that's what developing truths and stuff, the Sagittarius themes are all about. They're all about us finding the truth, but not exactly finding the absolute truth, because there's no absolute truth in this world, or at least as far as we know. And that's really hard for a lot of people to handle. They want absolutes. They want the world to be black and white. They want life to be predictable. They want people to be in boxes. Why? Because it's easier in survival instincts. We're still very much embody the energy of animals who are constantly, if you think about like a squirrel on a tree. It loves being on a tree with its nuts and blah, blah, blah. Well, what if something like a cat jumps on that same tree one day to get it, and it managed to survive? Will it go back to that tree? Maybe not. It may be even more cautious after that, experiencing something attacking them. It takes only one incident for you to be cautious. This is also true with us as humans when it comes to things that we are not familiar with or unknown, and one bad experience can almost determine a truth for us. Because of this happens. And, that is somewhat true. We subconsciously do that because, like animals, we do whatever we can. Any, something that goes against what's keeping us safe, we must protect ourselves to a certain extent. Now, of course, we've developed consciousness more often than not. So it's more physiology now that attaches itself in that sense. So I just find that all very fascinating because, if anything, we're all kind of just lying to ourselves about what the true truth is. Obviously science has more credibility in this sense because they have a diplomatic way and not diplomatic, but maybe more democratic way, like Bruce says, that of testing things to make sure, and that enough people who have expertise and who have done the same test is also in validity to the same results. And thus it can be a theory. But there's always a chance, and the science community knows this very well, that something could come around and disprove that. And so as humans, we need to be open to that. But I think the problem is most humans don't like being proven wrong. And so I feel like this Pluto Aquarius transit is going to really test the science community quite a bit when it comes to what's right and what's wrong. Now, will that make ability for more astrology? I don't know. Now, that could be more when Pluto goes into Pisces, which by then, you know, that will be my last bit of my lifetime. Will be like, I think after my Saturn return, I think, or my second one. And yeah, so, and I might very well live to see astrology get its fertility before I die. That would be nice to know. You know, I don't think I'm going to live past Pluto going past my 12th house, but I certainly am going to try to live past to see at least Pluto in Pisces. I want to live at least that long. I probably will. I'll probably at least live till Pluto in Aries if that comes to it. But for the most part, I think I'm going to live until at least through all of Pluto and Pisces and partial Pluto of Aquarius. Maybe once it hits my ascendant, I'll be dead. So, but you know, but it is what it is. But yeah, but I think it's because I'm a 12th house person. I'm okay with death. I'm fascinated by death, and I'm obsessed with it. I love the thought of endings and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm a weirdo. So I've been like that even before all my trauma. So I was always fascinated by death. I used to be embarrassed to admit that because people had noticed it. And I was like, no, I'm not. Because I thought that would be weird. But then over time, now that I've expressed myself and accept myself, like, no, I am. I'm going to admit that I am. I've always been fascinated by the afterlife and what the truth behind it. I'm fascinated by the idea of what will happen when I die. It doesn't scare me at all. Probably why I was more involved into the suicide ideology back then, because I wasn't as afraid of death as, you know, back then until I have to face it, or the possibility of the pain of it, because that's different. Death itself isn't scary, but the pain of death and pain going through an end is a different experience. And obviously someone who wants to live, someone who has a desire to live, will not fear that. And so, you know, he's right about suicides not all being the same, because my suicide is different from someone who did actually commit suicide in general. So they were done with life because they were sick of how horrible it was, and they didn't see any way out because they didn't have a support system or had anyone that really gave a shit about them. You know? But, so I can understand why that happened, you know? They weren't really supported by the people around them. So yeah, I know that sounds really horrible, and you know, I'm sure people who have lost loved ones from suicide would not like hearing that, but it's pretty much the truth. Like, I'm sorry that hurts your feelings, but you know, I'm not here to cater to your feelings. I'm just telling you, you know, my idea of why people commit suicide. For me, it was more like I thought I had to, because I thought the voices in my heads were right and that they should be dead even though I didn't want to die. And so I attempted because I thought it was best for everyone. That was a delusion. That was a Neptunian influence delusion that I went through from my 12th house sphere, because I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't understand that, you know, my 12th house perfection year is still like by far the hardest year, and it's a year I'm really like forbidding on, even to now. Like, I'm in my 9th house. I'm kind of like at a square to it right now, and it's like this is why I'm taking my perfection years a lot more seriously, even though I haven't even done my SR report. I'm sorry, but I feel like I need to be in the right mindset to do it. I can't just force myself to do it. I have to be. Unfortunately, when I was gonna do it, I got extremely sick and was sick for a whole 2 months. It wasn't until now that I wasn't. And you know what my assumption was why that happened like that? The reason it happened was because I was going through a transformation. I was unmasking, and it was very traumatic for me because I had been becoming someone I didn't want to be. I was being what I thought everyone wanted to be, but was like secretly something else, the chaotic self outside. And when those suicides completely contradict yourselves, which is very...
which is in the nature of, sorry, it went off because the sound went off, so that's why, but it's within the nature. Oh my god, I lost my train of thought when this happened. I'm kind of like in this awkward situation. Let me see if you can hear me still. You still hear me? Oh, you can't hear me now. I can't hear it because I don't have my thing on. So give me a second. Let me listen to it real quick so I can continue what I'm saying. All right. So, yeah. How do I sound now? All right, I sound okay. So I'm only going to keep it on the forcip for just a moment, real quick. But what I was saying is that I think it's important to... Oh, fuck, I still forgot what I'm saying, so I'm trying to remember real quick. But what I'm trying to say... That really missed me up. I don't know. I wish I could reach back, but I think there's a way you can, but I don't remember. So we were talking about... Let me try to retrace what I was talking about. We were talking about, suicide and how my reasoning behind it and was different from someone who actually did have a shit life, didn't have the support, and then they actually did it, versus me who had a delusion that I had to because I didn't quite see. I think it's because the pain of things or the ideas of stuff not working out was too much for me, and I was pushing myself to my absolute human limit to what I am now, and that was really, really, really painful for me in general. And so that ended up getting me to these grand illusions because, again, I had MDD and was like not facing reality, and created that sort of environment where I would hear those voices or have that sort of situation. And because I was so sick the past few months, is because I'm actually unmasking them, and it actually caused a visceral reaction from my body. And also because it was the end tail of the flu season as well. And I hadn't taken a flu shot in a long time, so I think it overall is a bunch of things, not just one thing at a time, but just overall a bunch of stuff that kind of collected together. And this is just an assumption on my part that I just found, because I tend to come up with ideas based on the circumstances surrounding it at the moment. Because yes, that was when I was starting therapy, and I was going through a huge transformation of letting go of a lot of stuff, and my body indirectly was reacted to that, which only furthered the fact that, I was already emotionally irregulated, so I was more prone to getting sick, more prone to a lot of crashes, a lot more meltdowns, and thus I was in the tail end. So when I started trying to get it back together, my body was still in that situation, and even though I was doing a lot better, I still was getting sick, because it's not like suddenly you have this realization of life and you're like, oh, happy, suddenly your sickness is going to go away. The sickness is always there. It was always going to be part of there, regardless if I went to therapy or not. In fact, I probably would have been sick a bit longer. So it was the longest I've been sick for a really long time. It seems like every year me being sick is getting actually longer. It used to be where I would get sick maybe once or twice a year. Then I went to the 3 to 4 times a year. Now it's up to about half the year I'm sick. And this was by far the longest I've been sick at one time, 2 months. That is just insane. There was only maybe a week of where I was okay, but I was still sick. That's not everything. I just kept getting more and more sick. And it was around the time I was going through my therapy and trying to heal and reconcile for a lot of things that I've done and have been done to me. And so I think in a way, it did have a visual effect. It took me a while, but I continued to keep trying to regulate myself. Keep at it despite not seeing results right away. Because I know that not everything can just change out of nowhere. I learned that from eating disorders and just in general trying to get my health back together in the past, and I'm a 6th health perfection year. It takes a lot more effort than just doing something once and then hoping things change. That's not how it works, man. You have to get your whole body in gear towards it. It could take months to years to get used to that. That's why I always tell people who are trying to lose weight, who see what I've done, I've lost enough weight to say this, is that no, it took me 3 or 4 years to get to where I'm at, and I'm not even at the ideal weight I would have liked in the past. But I've learned to accept my body for what it was, because I'm fine. I don't need to be sexy with abs and blah blah blah. Who am I trying to impress, huh? That's why people do it, to look aesthetically pleasing, because they like to look good and be desirable. But I'm not like that at all. I confuse desirability with respect, and that's two things that can kind of come together, but they don't necessarily are the same thing. So obviously they're different definitions, but we tend to sort of conflate the two terms without realizing it, and I realized that's what I was doing. So instead, I was like, you know what? I like the way my body is now. I like the way I look. I might not be the best looking person. I might be the ugliest, whatever. Who cares? You know, I still don't like to show my face because I hate how my face looks, though. I'm not at that level. I'm not like, oh, I'm fine the way I am. I'm going to show my face because I don't know. It's more like, I'm fine the way I am. I'm not the best looking person. I'm not the ugliest. I'm still a bit self-conscious, yeah, because I don't like to look at my face. So obviously that's not completely true, because I'm not at the point where I accept looking at it, but because I freaking do a weird mouth thing when I'm like streaming. I hate looking at myself doing that. So that's literally the only reason why, and I'm just embarrassed by it too, due to, you know, ableism and, you know, all that stuff, just because I don't know how to control my face. I was never really taught. I just do really random shitty faces. It's no wonder people think I'm fucking weird. And that's okay, because that's just how I am, and I can't really stop from people thinking that. Why do I need to worry about it? It's not like they gave a shit about me to begin with. But for them to make that comment, pretty much just them just judging me. Me doing anything else, they would judge me on that too, whether negative or good. And so people are entitled to opinions, yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be the truth of what I am, because that's their only observation. That's not a truth. That's just an observation. So yeah. Anyway, we'll go back to what we were listening to in a minute, so that way we can listen to it. So yeah.
Significant revolution like biology did, or geology did, or physics. You know, these subjects have gone through these big revolutions, and they've become changed and organized. And I think that conditions have just not been right for astrology, because astrology is the subject that studies, analyzes, and maps self-organizing systems. And self-organizing systems are relatively recently recognized as a distinct phenomena. You know, systems that have emergent properties, I mean, these are not easily reducible. So that's why astrology is behind, one of the reasons why astrology is behind the times on, you know, having a revolution that would allow it to be better organized as a subject. And I also want to make perfectly clear that I'm not concerned with astrology being accepted by the rest of the world. Oh, look at that. You know, I have a transiting Saturn on my Mercury now, so I guess my image, you know, video image just freezes from time to time.
It's fine, it'll go away in a month.
Yeah, it'll go away. You know, just wait long enough with Saturn, right? There we go. We're back moving again. But that, you know, over time, you know, astrology, if it improves and gets serious about itself and gets organized, will just become recognized. It doesn't have to prove itself to some authority. It just has to get tighter and better. And you can't have a free-for-all, and you can't have a situation in astrology where getting astrologers to cooperate is like herding cats. And the reason why is because in order to make a living at astrology, you have to have a little business. You have to be, an entrepreneur, a sole proprietor. And you have to do a lot of things. Now you have to know the internet, and you got to be a broadcaster, and, you know, you have to publish. You have to do all these things. I mean, I've had to do them. I feel I was fortunate to live a lot of my life before the internet. I don't know, maybe I would see it different if I was born later, but I see the internet as like a bit of a nightmare.
I don't know. I could see you being a big hit on TikTok right now. Possibly might consider that at some point. Could be good.
Well, maybe. You know, I'm spending most of my time just trying to keep my health going.
Yeah.
Lead a ritualistic daily routine of little exercises and, so on, just to keep the whole system going. I don't have a lot extra. I felt sad. I sold my old skis the other day. I hadn't used them in a long time. Sorry to see that go. But anyway, yeah, I think that, getting back to the subject, I think that if astrology internally improves itself, that will make such a difference. The subject will be better recognized by others, but who cares? It'll make it on its own. It'll show itself that it can be a subject and it can contribute to the conversation. Astrology is not really contributing now to the world in any significant way, and I think it should. It has a lot to say, a lot to offer.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely, in the last chapter of the book, you really focus, while you spend a good deal of time talking about external pressures and issues that have kept astrology relegated to the fringes of society for the most part, especially in intellectual circles. You also spend a good deal of time talking about like some of the internal issues in the astrological community and areas where we kind of need to clean up our act and get it together as a community in order to take astrology into the next level or into the next era.
Yeah. Well, astrology operates as an outsider bubble, in a bubble. I mean, it's a bubble culture. It has its own rules and regulations, and when you get in those situations, it's really a survival crisis of a collective. And you help yourself along, and everybody's an astrologer. I'm an astrologer. What does that mean? You decided you're an astrologer, right? I'm a professional astrologer. I make some money. How much money? You make a living at it, or is it part-time? Is your spouse, covering you, or what? It's just not clear. It's a free-for-all. And you can go on and on for a while with a free-for-all, but it doesn't really work in the long run. And so, in the meanwhile, it's a cultural bubble. It's isolated. And it's still recovering from the, centuries of attacks from the church and ostracism by, physicists and skeptics and so on. It's in bad shape, and so it needs some work. It needs some focus, some agreements on how best to proceed to develop astrology as a subject that can contribute to the global conversation on what is nature and what is life, how do things work. And,
So one of your points was that because astrology fell out of the universities, and because it's a largely unregulated field at this point, while there was a push in the 80s and 90s to do some certifications of astrology in order to set some standards, that there needs to be more of a push towards that, because otherwise there's no way to distinguish between who's like a good practitioner of astrology or one that is either ethical or skilled or other well-educated, other things like that, versus somebody who just started studying astrology like a week ago and started calling themselves an astrologer right away or something like that.
Yeah, I think that there's no perfect solution. Let me just be clear about that. There's no perfect solution, but education and testing is probably the best option available, and other subjects have done that. So when you go to see a doctor, you want to see a doctor that went to med school. And although the medical field produces certified doctors, not all of them are that good. There's a range of difference, but at least it prevents the quacks from holding a high position. It's a sorting out mechanism. It's an establishment of some kind of standards. I'm saying that some set of standards is better than none. For multiple reasons, one of which is better for the astrological community because it will allow institutions to grow, which will then allow astrology to progress and develop itself. I don't believe astrology is perfect as it is. I think astrology is a work in progress.
Right, but that something like that, while even though if we had better certification and better standards in astrology, that just like any other field or other disciplines, there's going to be a range of different practitioners in terms of their level of skill at their job or what they do, as well as their ethics or other things like that. It would at least give some baseline for when people try to do studies like the Vernon Clark studies, where they're trying to get together a group of skilled practitioners of astrology and have them match charts in a controlled setting, because in a test like that, you want to know and be able to have some sort of distinction between, who's a practitioner of this subject or a skilled practitioner versus who's not.
Yeah, I think if you're doing like a Vernon Clark type study now, what you would do is you would select, the people you were testing to have, say, some level of astrological certification plus, some number of years of practice. And then you'd be more likely than not to get people that knew what they were talking about.
That would increase, certainly, the things. There's definitely other things you could maybe add on top of that I think I would like to see in terms of standardization if astrologers were to start engaging in tests like that again. That actually raises an issue that I've been having, which I'm kind of nervous about, which is going back to the observation I've made where I feel like in the past decade the skeptic community has kind of fallen apart and kind of decline in the leadership, sometimes due to the loss of major leaders like James Randi, who were at the center of things for several decades, or in other instances through the sidelining of some of those figures due to like social issues and different politics and things like that. But I'm a little nervous that the current generation of astrologers who came in this huge influx or this huge wave into the community over the past few years has so little experience dealing with the more militant sort of variety of scientific skepticism, that they're going to be a little caught off guard and a little underprepared for how to deal with some of those arguments compared to people back in the 80s and 90s where that was like a more common thing that you had to deal with like more frequently.
Maybe. I don't know for sure because I haven't really been all that active in astrology in the last 10 or 20 years, really. I've kind of stayed, kept one foot in it, but I was doing other things and had my own health problems. But I think it should be part of any kind of astrological education, an understanding of criticisms of astrology. That should be a course, a required course in my opinion.
For sure, or doing research to understand some of the different studies that have been done in the past and some of the pros and cons for those studies. Like when it comes to like the Gogolin studies or the Vernon Clark trials or other things like that, like having done maybe like a literature review of some of that stuff.
Yeah, and people have written things about it. There was an article called Debunking the Debunkers that's stirred them all up. Valerie Bourne is the author of that. And, there's a history of arguing between astrologers and the skeptics. And if somebody could put all that together, that would be a great book right there, a great document, and very useful for people new in astrology so that they would understand what the criticisms are and what the responses are.
Is arguing with skeptics fundamentally productive? Because I feel like there's a tendency sometimes early in one's studies of astrology to have that motivation to feel to like want to defend it more and to get into some of those arguments, but then eventually later on, sometimes not always, people mellow out or realize that sometimes it's not productive or that it's a waste of time, and maybe don't engage in that as much.
It's a waste of time to argue with these people most of the time. But I think what would be great is a collection of arguments between skeptics and astrologers in a book, but written by somebody who has, a sociologist, for example, or a psychologist who would really be able to analyze where these people are coming from and what the argument means in a larger context. Various arguments, maybe historical connections to them and so on. Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that astrologers would benefit from, being able to step out of the bubble and see, okay, there's an argument going on with this one group, and we know that it's just a waste of time to argue with them because, they have a positivist philosophy and they're not going to really budge on it. But let's look at it in perspective. What is it? What does it say about our culture? What does it say about, who's in charge and who's making definitions? And what does it say about astrology's strengths and weaknesses? These are the kinds of things that the astrological community could learn from.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability to look at astrology critically has always been one of the major hallmarks of some of the greatest figures in the history of astrology, the greatest astrologers, and the ones who made the greatest contributions to the understanding of the theory and philosophy and the way that astrology integrates with science and the natural world. And that's often a tension within those figures, like the Ptolemy type figures or the Kepler figures, where on the one hand, they can sometimes be highly critical of certain parts of the astrological tradition that they view as not valid or that doesn't work, or superstitious stuff that they want to reject and set aside, versus in other parts of astrology that they view as valid or useful or effective in some ways to retain. And that's what the Kepler's famous, don't throw it out with the bathwater phrase.
Yeah. Also, Francis Bacon had a good deal on say on astrology and what should be thrown at, what shouldn't. But people have done this. People talk about it in science. Nobody's really done it. The distinction between astrology theory and astrology practice, comes into play here. The practice, follows its own path. Just like, medicine does, a lot is determined, on the fly through, experience. And then it kind of gets back to the research area and they test it out and find out what might really be going on. But we don't have that in astrology. We just have the practice. And it moves at its own pace. But what we need is to have some way of organizing what's being learned, capturing it. These days we have some really good practitioners. Eventually they write a book and learn something about it.
Yeah, that used to be part of the role of the astrological organizations, and I feel like that's something that's changed recently. Issue with the community is that the astrological organizations are struggling to find relevance and to stay relevant in contemporary times. One of the things that they did was a service previously, prior to the internet, that this was a very important feature of the community, was have journals and publications so that there was centralized almost repository for publishing astrological research or for having discussions in the community. But that's one of the things that with the rise of the internet that's almost become less relevant or useful, and it's one of the ways that the organizations are kind of struggling to reinvent themselves in the early 21st century.
I don't know if I would agree with that. NCGR, for example, has continuously published a journal. They had a magazine and a journal, Geocosmic Journal, and what was the other one? There was two of them that came out. Now it's just down to one a year. And they publish articles. Some of them are quite good. Scott Silverman edited one on newly discovered bodies, hyperbolic objects and things like that. And I thought it was pretty good. People wrote some pretty good articles about it, talking about their experience. The problem is that if you're a practitioner, you don't have the time and probably not the knowledge to do, a first-class reductionist science experiment on astrology and publish it. So the organizations, even though they may have been formed around the idea of doing that, International Society for Astrological Research, National Council for Geocosmic Research, that's what they wanted to do. But the reality is, nobody's got the time or the knowledge to do it. It's just too hard to do without some kind of support. I was worked at the university for a long time, and I know what that's about. You go begging to, the National Science Foundation or somebody else to get money, and then you get $100,000. Then half of that goes to the university, and then now you've got $50,000 to work for a year on your project, or however long it might be. That's how you get stuff done. We don't have anything like that in astrology.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess that's part of my point, is that the astrological organizations are nonprofits that are largely run by unpaid volunteers,
right,
whose numbers have declined drastically over the course of the past few decades. And the contributions to those journals are just from whatever's available, and most
membership.
of the time,
They're from membership, largely.
Yeah, from membership. But then the membership is largely just practitioners who are not necessarily researchers in the sense of these aren't primarily like scientific journals at this point.
No,
They're
they can't be.
right
Because the
'cause
astrologers don't know how to do reductionist science, and the subject's too hard to test. And there's no
right.
support for it. You know, give somebody $100,000, you know, that really knows astrology, and they might be able to come up with a good test. And it might take them a couple of years, and then they make $50,000 a year.
And I think that was part of your point at one point about conferences as well, which is that oftentimes it's more like market factors
Yeah.
that drive the types of discussions that happen at conferences because people are more interested, astrologers or astrology enthusiasts are more interested in learning techniques that they can use to apply to their own birth chart or to the charts of clients than they are typically in hearing about, you know, tests of astrology or statistical analysis of astrology, and lectures like that tend to be far less, to attract less and therefore to not be featured as much. And that's also a major shift, I feel like, in the astrological community in the past few decades.
Yeah, I mean, astrology is market-driven largely, and it spills into the conferences. You have to have, you know, a topic that's going to draw people, because then that brings in more people to the conference, and that allows the conference committee to pay for the expenses of having a trade show and all that. That's just how it works right now. You know, that's how it's going. I mean, I think that the organizations have had their challenges. You know, they still seem to be going fairly well. They have certification programs. NCGR has an old certification program that is separate from NCGR now that I'm involved with. That's one of my feet in astrology is in that. It's called Professional Astrologers Alliance. And, you know, there's an effort to update the exams, and it's geared off Ken Negus's vision of a 4-year college program in astrology. And so level 1, there's an exam, and that it assumes that you have, it's your freshman year. And there are equivalencies. Like if you go through the Kepler program and you get their certificate, you automatically qualify for levels 1, 2, and 3. It's like you have your freshman, sophomore, and junior year completed. And then the senior year is more like, you know, you do your own report, and there are different requirements for that. But it's something, you know. It's, you know, the organizations are doing something, and I think without them, astrology would be more impoverished. They play a role, and so do the schools, Kepler College and IAA, and there are a few others. And they are the organizations and the schools are right now all the institutions that they comprise the institutions that astrology has. They're not much, and they don't, you know, and they're mostly volunteers, you point out, but they're what we got.
Yeah, they're what we got for sure. I'm curious how that's going to grow and evolve, and what steps could be taken to improve some of those things. And I do feel like there's a struggle to maintain relevancy of them to a certain extent amongst the younger generation of astrologers who hasn't seen as much about why they should become involved in those things or what the benefit or advantage is. So that's something that's kind of going on as a generational thing right now, where it was more necessary 30 years ago. Like those mailing lists, for example, that the astrological organizations put out, that's where you heard about what was going on in the community. But nowadays you hear what's going on in the community more so through social media and things like that. So that's why I'm saying there's sometimes an attempt to reinvent themselves or to understand what their relevancy can be in the modern period, where some of those things have shifted a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the organizations which were formed in time where there was no internet, need to adjust to the internet. I mean, that's what happens. You know, you if you're born in it, you know, my son is 35 years old. He knows exactly how to work in that world. You know, I'm older. I've figured it out enough to get by, but I'm, you know, no expert. If I had to market myself as an astrologer right now, I would have to do a lot of work. I would have to, you know, put a lot into it. So it is. Right. It's a different medium, and the organizations, you know, are using it. They're not using it, you know, entirely. I think that there are other factors involved too. If you're a libertarian, you don't really want a group. You just kind of want to operate on your own. And I think that the organizations represent a kind of, a social responsibility aspect. Not that they all deliver it, but it comes out of a group model. Like we're all in it together. So again, it does reinforce the astrological bubble in some ways. But it also provides a community, where information can be shared and that's focused around something. Those two organizations, ESAR and NCGR, they were originally focused around research, as you point out, and now the research is too hard to do, and nobody's qualified to do it. So what are they? They're a social group of some sort. They're a social group that brings together amateurs, people who love the subject, and some professionals. And, I think you're absolutely right. There is a search for relevance and meaning as time goes on. We'll see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that both of them have research in their titles, but that research and what that means is not the same as when they were set up in the 1970s and 80s, I think is a good example of that shift. One thing I wanted to make sure I ask you about is a term and a phrase that you use like multiple times throughout the book that I always associate with you, and I always thought it was like one of the best phrases ever, is for a birth chart, you call it a time slice, or for an astrological chart, you call it a time slice.
It is.
What does that mean, or could you expand on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't like the use of the word horoscope for a chart because I don't think it's quite that accurate. As I understand it, it means like view of the hour, right?
It's like hour marker.
Hour marker. So it probably refer more to the ascendant, I would think.
Yeah, it originally meant the ascendant in the first house.
In the history of trigonometry, the challenge of calculating the ascendant goes down as like one of the biggest things ever. I mean, that's what they were going for. They were going for that ascendant, that horoscope. Anyway, I don't think I think the word's been ruined by all these newspaper columns and so on. So I prefer to call it a birth chart. But the birth chart itself is a photograph of the sky. And, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're looking south. East is to your left and west is to your right. It's a shot. It's it's a time slice.
Snapshot.
It's a snapshot or a time slice because that's what a time snapshot is. And it's a term that's used in the sciences. In geoscience, I've heard it used there, but I think there are a few other places. But it makes the most sense to me. I see it as one of the two primary techniques that is subject of astrology.
It's like something is right there. Right there. That's something we need to have. I really want to go to that though. So yeah, alright, let me go. Yeah. See if I have any food I can. Alright, let's try this again. I'm trying to see if I can get there even faster. Because I don't want to have to go through all, but I'm pretty far from it, so I probably will have to watch this be an icicle land. Looks like icicle. Or maybe it's a sand place? I'll probably end up using all of these. All right, one more. Alright. Woohoo! I made it. What's up with the slime? Yeah, there, help me. Slugs fell upon me so suddenly. I could wash it away if only I had some water. Okay, so I need water. So the reason why I can't go in there is it needs water. Oh wait, is this the splash fruit? Can we use it on our thing and get rid of it then? Let's try it. See what happens. Because I think you can... Do you need it... Well, no, you wouldn't be able to cook with something to put it on something. Alright, let's try... Oh, okay. So I need to help this guy. Oh, I can throw it. Okay. You saved me. Thank you. I was shameful this should have happened to me. Captain the guarded Zora's domain. Unbelievable. Ugh. After the upheaval, the filth suddenly began falling from the sky. They soiled the waters around here, and in Zora's domain, everyone's at their wits' end because of it. That's why I set out to investigate the surrounding area myself, to think I would fall prey for falling slug myself. Just thinking of it makes my scales bristle. My skills. My gills still feel so uncleaned. If you hadn't not sprayed me with water, I shudder to think what would have happened to me. Please take this to Zora's spear as a token of my thanks. I'm sorry that it's not much, but it's all I have. Decayed all the other weapons at the time of the upheaval, but well, if it's not unusable at least. Oh, I ended up... Poor guy. I felt bad for him. That sucks. I was just simply trying to get this. Because I was trying to find a fast way to go here to unlock... I was going to take advantage of that sky totem. I'm going to definitely make more, stamina meters, so that way I can just keep doing that. And of course, yeah, have the ability to do that. So, yeah, so we'll listen to it once we, get this. But yeah, we're almost actually over halfway done with the nature astrology. I definitely will try to say what we've listened to and stuff. But I really like this podcast because it really does go into touch why we haven't really disproven skeptics in general, if that makes sense. What is that right there? All I know is that there's another area over there, and if we can... That way we can at least get the phenomenons all situated. Oh yeah, look at that. Everything's pretty good. All right. I am curious about what this is, so... Oh, it's a shrine. I didn't know that. How many shrines have I found? 1. Wow, that's cool. This. Holy crap, this is so cool. All right, y'all. We'll go back to listening. Sorry, but that was fun. I'm gonna turn off back real quick so we can listen.
Employs in as analyzing self-organizing systems that are subject matter, the time slice and the
Get it
cycle.
from geoscience? Is that what you think?
I may have, I'm trying to think where else I may have gotten it from. Philosophy, I'm not sure.
Because that actually makes sense. Because I'm thinking of like sometimes when you drive through the mountains here in Denver, like a highway that they've cut through a mountain. Sometimes you'll drive through, and on the side you'll just see the different layers of sediment, and you realize that you're seeing stuff that built up over hundreds and thousands and millions of years, but that one of those little layers is what you're talking about, is a time slice.
Yeah, you see that in marine cores and ice cores, where you're looking for the history of the atmosphere and the oceans, so you have a core and you slice it at some point, and since you're measuring time and what was going on in those times, you can call it a time slice. But it's a good question. I've been using it for a long time, and I probably got it from geosciences, but I'm not positive. I may have run across it in some other. Anyway, it stuck with me. I just thought it made the most sense. This is what we're doing. As astrologists, we're analyzing a time slice calculated for a moment of that, a tipping point of some sort, transition point, a bifurcation is the word I use in the book often. But we also use cycles. And in the past in astrology, those were called revolutions. Cycles of Jupiter and Saturn and things like that. It's kind of a broad use for the term revolution, wouldn't you say? Because you can use it, but it's not a hard. You're not talking about time slices or charts with revolutions, except when something crosses the vernal equinox.
Yeah, revolution. It's just going back to the original meaning of that, which is a return to something, or for a cycle to be completed, and for something to come back to where it started.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a cycles thing. So I would say astrology analyzes time slices and cycles. And those are the two main approaches.
And I love that. And there's something really important there about the phrasing it as a time slice that gets to the heart of sort of the title of your book, what is the nature of astrology? But when you conceptualize let's just say a birth chart, for the sake of argument, instead of generalizing an astrological chart, but you're taking something where time is always flowing, and you have like a start point, like point A, and then eventually it flows to point B. But it's like a continuous process that never stops moving, and the planets always keep moving in their orbits and their cycles and their movements through the solar system. But then at the moment of a birth chart, you freeze that and you take a snapshot of that moment in time and where the planets are placed relative to each other in their orbits. And there's something about that slice of time then that becomes important for describing the nature of what happened in that moment, as well as its future, essentially. Yeah,
because the time slice shows where you are amongst all the various cycles that are going on, all the revolutions, right? And so the astrology has developed all sorts of techniques to unpack information stored that way in the time slice.
Right. So
like aspects, like applying and separating, that would be like one obvious approach.
Mm-hmm. So that, and that's fundamental to your conceptualization of the nature of astrology and what it is, that it's the study of those time slices within the context of self-organizing systems like humans, but also other self-organizing systems on Earth.
Yeah, there could be, non-human animals. You could do charts for gorillas.
Yeah, I think you actually cited a study at some point that somebody had done about dogs.
Dogs,
and different types of dogs that had different measurable, not just their personalities in a weird sense or in like a human sense, but in the terms of like their like different dogs have more aggressive personalities or different things like that, and that somebody had tried to study that.
Yeah, the breeders write down the personalities of the dogs, because the buyers want to know that. what's her name? It's a French hyphenated name. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now, but she wrote a number of scientific papers that related astrology to biology, and they're very good. And she did one with the dogs, and it's basically a replication of Falkland, except using dogs. Because it tracks the diurnal cycle, correlating with the personality of the dogs.
So the point there would be like your view that there's something universal about astrology and how it works, that it doesn't just have to be applied to humans, even though it's most commonly done in that context with birth charts, but that astrological charts or time slices can be applied to other living entities that have a life cycle or like a temporal component to their existence.
Yeah, and things that are not living, things like, decisions or, electional astrology, you compute your own time slice, when you want to make a move. But there is a tendency in astrology to be very anthropocentric, and I think that's not good. In general, I think that's a bad thing. I think that humans got to get out of that. That's the equivalent of like the Earth is in the center of the solar system. It's like humans are in the center of the solar system.
The application of that to electional and horary astrology was the part that I was like the most uncertain about in terms of the extension of some of the causal arguments to astrology and how that would work, because that's the point where astrology starts to be much more abstract and symbolic and sort of removed from the more like biological considerations that might be more relevant when we're talking about like humans or dogs or what have you.
Yeah, well, the subject of higher order systems, self-organizing systems, which would include personality, the mind, group behaviors, and so on, it's pretty new. We don't know a lot about it, and I try to explain some of it in the last chapter, and then show how that information could be very relevant to explaining horary and electional astrology. But I mentioned a number of authors there, and if somebody was really interested, they could see that papers are being published on it. The philosophers talk about emergence, and so do scientists. It's a new area. I think I mentioned somewhere that I think it's as radical as quantum mechanics, except that it just hasn't gained traction because it's spread out among a whole bunch of disciplines.
Yeah, one point that you started getting to that I thought was really interesting that might be at the core of it and could perhaps be developed more at some point is it almost seemed like you were saying at one point that anything that has any self-organizing system that has a bifurcation at some point, that to the extent that you can cast a chart or a time slice for that moment of bifurcation or that moment where something in its existence meets a fork in the road where it can go one direction or another, that the analysis of that temporal moment in time is anything that experiences that you can use astrology to analyze that, both that temporal moment in time as well as project it out into the future. Yeah,
you can see its trajectory. Yeah, it's almost reminiscent of Lorenz, the butterfly effect guy. He found out that if he put all these this information about weather to model it, and he found that if he changed the starting point, the results were completely different. So that's like a kind of analogy to what happens in astrology. You have this starting point. In the case of people, it's the transition from water breathing to air breathing, and separation from the mothership. So it's a bifurcation point, a big shift and change. You look at that time slice, and then you've got a good sense of where things are going. But it could have been at a different time, and things would be different.
Yes, to me that gets into some really important things, because it starts to become more about the study of astrology starts to become more about the nature of time, or there's something there that starts getting to the mechanism of underlying astrology being something much broader that has to do with time, the nature of time, and the role that time plays in our experience of reality or in nature. That's hard to articulate, but it was something you were starting to point to there that seemed very important towards the end of the book.
Yeah, I really, there's so many unanswered questions, but yeah, there's, what is really going on in astrology is going to require a lot more knowledge than we have right now about things like time and about things like internal time. I bring up ideas about imprinting, in cases of human development. The planet's timing windows of imprint vulnerability, and basically encoding certain kind of patterns, and that they relate to the planets, some of the inner planets. I don't say that that's an explanation for all of astrology, but that's kind of where things might be going. I do state pretty clearly that I think that a lot of astrology might be explainable, maybe not, maybe not right now. There needs to be more work done in some of the other sciences, and that this is, the present moment in some ways is like poor John Goad trying to do his study of astrometeorology in the middle of the 17th century and not having access to reliable thermometers and barometers and weather vanes. And actually had that. Hygrometers, all sorts of, instrumentation. I mean, modern science is based on instrumentation, which produces units that you can do reductionist science with. He also didn't have statistics. He just had, he had averages, more or less, that sort of thing. So I think astrology today is at a similar point. We just don't have the science. We have the beginnings, I think, of the science of self-organizing systems. We have the beginnings of that. But I think that astrology as a field should pay more attention to that and should define itself as a subject. And, whether it doesn't have the institutional power to fund research and theory, it should just be more aware of it. Whether the internet is going to be able to bring that to enough people or enough people to get it, I don't know. But, I think astrology will survive as a subject, but I think it could do a lot better if there was a little more awareness that it's not limited to practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think after reading your book, I think it's up there on the level of Cosmos and Psyche in terms of important discussions about the nature of astrology that will be very impactful on the next generation of astrologers. And it doesn't have the same aim as Cosmos and Psyche in that your book is not trying to prove astrology or necessarily demonstrate its validity through case studies or something like that, or examples, but it's trying to explain astrology and where it's at now and how it got there, how it got here, and to present that to a more intellectual audience in order to give people a sort of like heads up about the subject and what the deal is with it. As well as some statements about where it might head in the future and how the trajectory of astrology might be improved, so that the place of astrology might be improved in society at some point in the future.
Yeah, that's just about it. Yeah. I think it's a call to break out of the bubble and look around. Stick your head out of the bubble and look around, like that old medieval woodcut, Renaissance woodcut.
Right, so that on the one hand, that's an encouragement for people outside of the astrological community to stick their head outside the bubble and see that there might be something to astrology, but then on the other side, it's also an encouragement for astrologers to stick their heads outside of the bubble of the astrological community and to try to engage in other fields of research and other disciplines that might be helpful to astrology or might be interrelated and might be necessary to learn and specialize in order to get anywhere closer to either creating a grand unified system of astrology again that integrates with other sciences, or in terms of getting closer to trying demonstrating some sort of validity of astrology to the public.
Yeah, raising the level of the field, raising the level of understanding, the caliber of the practitioner, the general understanding of where astrology has been, where it's at, and where it might go. That's what I hope for. I invested a lot of my life in astrology. It's one of my major identity points, and so I hope to see it progress.
Yeah, well, I can already see and anticipate that works like this and like Cosmos and Psyche together will probably be the works that are necessary in order to appeal to explain astrology and to sort of make a case for astrology to somebody in the future that's going to come along at some point, just like at times in the past, like when you get like a Ptolemy figure or a Kepler figure who are just like these polymaths that try to take astrology and integrate it with the contemporary views about how the cosmos works and creates a new paradigm then that lasts for several centuries at that point and makes astrology acceptable again by giving it a cosmological framework. And I have a pretty good feeling that your book will be one of the ones on the bookshelf of the person who comes along at some point in the future and does that.
Well, that's nice to think about. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody from outside of astrology, comes into the field at some point and really does something with it. Because I've seen a few things like this. I've seen some people in meteorology, for example, really apply some pretty sophisticated, complex astrological techniques to weather formations. Stuff that I would never think about because I don't know meteorology. But somebody from psychology, for example, could come into the field and revolutionize it. And we have the software now. That's one thing that is wonderful. Having the software to do astrology. Wow, I remember the days when I was cranking it out on a slide rule.
Right. Yeah. Back in the old days with the cuneiform tablets and stuff.
Yeah. Well, actually, I summarized the whole, what I learned about calculating charts in a book. Did you ever see a book that I wrote, Astrological Chart Calculations?
I did. That was a very heavy, that's actually surprisingly more heavy read than some of the science chapters of this book.
I think I sold 100 copies. But,
Okay.
Margaret, Cahill from Wessex Astrologer also puts it in. But it's kind of a summary of what I learned before computers.
Yeah. One of the last things I want to say was just that I was very influenced by Geoffrey Cornelius's argument for the past 15, 20 years or so, as well as I got into ancient astrology and studied Hellenistic astrology and understood the pre-Ptolemaic views of astrology that were more based on the mechanism of astrology working through signs and omens and something approximating synchronicity, that I've been very taken by that argument and very taken by the notion that astrology, the mechanism underlying astrology is a causal for a number of years. But I've had this thing in the back of my head for a number of years where I also realized that traditionally astrology was associated with Mercury, and there's many different areas when it comes to Mercury where Mercury traditionally always straddles the divide between two different seemingly irreconcilable positions, like night and day, masculine and feminine, or what have you. And oftentimes with astrology, you run into a similar issue where sometimes it's when you have what looks like an either-or situation, sometimes it ends up being both. And one of the biggest things that your book kind of impressed on me was that while I've thought about astrology entirely and conceptualized it in a causal framework, definitely the first two chapters have opened up the question that maybe one shouldn't completely reject the notion that there could ever be any sort of causal mechanisms to astrology that could play some sort of role in the overall reason why astrology works or the reason why it does what it does, and that doesn't have to be fundamentally incompatible with the other view necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is emphasize the importance of natural astrology, right?
Right.
Which would include astrometeorology, it would include mundane astrology and all that. And, pay a little bit more attention to that and see that there are causal mechanisms for it. And then, look at the human situation as, a particular case in nature. And, try to understand that as best we can using, what's known about self-organizing systems, higher order self-organizing systems, meta-cybernetic, more complicated, both physical and mental at the same time, and learn what we can learn. But you may have also caught my drift that I don't make any claims for one thing or the other. I'm just kind of this harmonious observer that's going along in my life, and you know, I make some statements about things like calling astrology divination. I don't think is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I do think you strongly reject the conceptualization of astrology as divination, and you also see...
And all of astrology is divination. I mean, you know, and divination, you know, you can call a lot of things. Like a good guess is, you know, kind of divination, or maybe you know. Election predictions is divination by, you know, for some people. You know, they make a call and they don't use statistics on it.
Well, no, I mean, divination is actually a very specific class of practices that often take a random or chance-like allotment of something in nature.
Yeah, throw the dice.
Yeah, throw the dice, throw the tarot cards, or throw the coins in the I Ching. But then, contrary to how that would work out if you kept doing that over and over again on a long enough timeline, and statistically it would always just be 50-50, that you take the singular moment of that chance like allotment and you interpret it as having symbolic significance, and in that moment it actually does, even though if you were to take it outside of that moment statistically, like, it wouldn't necessarily work out if you just kept doing it over and over again, because it's something about the nature of chance having a real symbolic import in that moment of the inquiry, if the inquiry has a charge or something important to it. And the argument is that that's what that's what birth charts are, that's what horary charts are, and everything else, because they're connected with this notion of a chance-like allotment. So that's contrary, though, to the notion that astrology is based on regularly recurring causal celestial forces that can be tested and analyzed statistically, like through the Goklan studies and stuff like that. And that's really, in the future, sort of post your work, is going to be the debate that astrologers are going to have, is between those two different camps, because they're a little bit in conflict with each other.
Sorry, I don't know what to do. I'm like paying attention to the broadcast and also trying to think of what to do next. And I'm like, what do we do then? So we have to somehow make it over that way. And that gives us an idea to go this way, right? And we could technically make it, but I'm wondering if we need to get these things over there. But how are we going to get it over there? I wonder if we attach this and this. It's probably not gonna work, but we're gonna try. Go on this and call. I guess these can't because... Yeah. So I don't know what the cart's for, though. Is it just to go over here? That's what I'm confused about. It's like, what is that for, though? If we can't go that way, then... Alright, then I'm gonna try something else. It's not gonna probably work, but let's see if it'll work. I don't know, y'all. This one's hard. This is in a different area I've never been to, so this is definitely really difficult. You can technically fly there, but you won't be able to reach to it. That's what they're saying. I could try to see if we can get it up there. Alright, so let's go recall a bunch of those carts and then we'll make a flyby there. Get like 4 and then it should be enough. Won't let me like go and stop this.
And while that debate's shifted more on the divinatory side over the past 30 years, your book reminds me that different astrologers have different views on that, and that it's not necessarily always 100% person.
Well, I think that, labeling astrology as divination and labeling astrology as nothing more than a practice, I think is the easy way out. I mean, that's the simple answer. I think it's a little bit more complicated, and I'm not saying that I have the answer to it. I mean, I've experimented with different kinds of divination systems. I published a book on one based on ancient Mexican, divination and astrology. I used to, I'd be playing with my band and a lot. I used to play every weekend, and I would have astro dice, and I would entertain people on breaks with that. I'd have them think of a question, roll the dice, and I would give them an answer. And I was like pretty accurate on it. And then I decided to put together a deck of business cards. So I collected all these business cards from people, and I would carry that along with me, and I would do I basically use a tarot-like pattern. I would read the business cards, and I would get good results from it. So I know that stuff goes on. And I think what it has to do with is some of these emergent, self-organizing systems out of human minds. And this is an area that has just not been fully researched. So basically what I'm saying is that even divination at this point is a candidate for a much better explanation for what it is.
So you're not fundamentally opposed to the concept of divination, the practice, because you've practiced it yourself to some extent in the past, but you think
I can douse, I can do that stuff.
But you think it's sort of like a cop-out when it comes to just saying that that's all astrology is.
Yeah.
And that's the purpose of some of your first 2 chapters in talking about different ways in which the celestial influences do influence Earth and its biosphere and life on Earth to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of evidence behind that. Yeah, I mean, life has evolved in a temporal environment, and the temporal environment is driven by geophysical and astronomical, realities. The moon is swinging around, and the sun is doing its thing, and the length of day is changing, and the length, we're bombarded with this information. It's baked in.
Right. So, but the question would be debated between astrologers is that the same as, or is there a jump from there to saying that, Mars in the 7th house in a day chart, or let's say Saturn in a night chart in the 7th house will correlate with somebody that gets, a divorce or something at the age of 30 at their Saturn return or something like that. But there starts being other, what seem like more symbolic considerations in astrology that sometimes the more naturalistic or causal explanations, it's harder to see how those would apply or how that would make sense?
Well, it is hard to see that. I mean, I'm suggesting, like a perspective, looking at these higher order self-organizing systems, which may be hypersensitive to all sorts of little things that go on, and there may be other forces yet to be discovered. We just don't know. All I'm saying is that, yeah, there are many ways to look at astrology, and just like, reducing it to divination is a lazy way out. That's not to diminish anything that Jeffrey Cornelius has done, because he's written a lot of really good things and looked at ancient astrology, and I like his book. I just think that there may be a lot more to divination than we think.
Yeah, I think that point is also just that there shouldn't be any blanket rejection of a mechanism just because a mechanism is not currently known, and that people perhaps need to keep an open mind about that possibility, especially if the phenomenon of astrology itself keeps pointing to these correlations between celestial movements and earthly events.
Yeah, I think that, at any given point in history, we don't know everything. I just read, Foucault's book, Madness and Civilization. I found it at the dump the other day. And, he's this French structuralist, postmodernist writer, but it was good because he basically showed how the societal understanding of madness has changed drastically over the centuries, and only recently are we starting to get it together. And of course, even right now, the psychologists are still trying to work out what a personality disorder is. So, if you think that, if you look at that and how recently our understanding of mental illness and that sort has come into focus, you got to look at astrology and say, oh, come on, we got a long way to go.
Right, and I think you actually cite a couple of instances in the past in science where there's been a phenomenon that was discovered or identified before and recognized before the mechanism for it was known.
Yeah, with electricity.
Okay. Could you explain that a little bit?
Or heat. I think that was the example I gave. Yeah, they didn't know what heat was. It took years, decades before it was, reduced to, an understanding of the thing.
Right.
It just wasn't known what it was. But you could do a lot with heat. You can get a stove going and boil water and make a steam engine.
Right, and all of those things were done before eventually developing like a scientific understanding of the processes behind heat and how to control and recreate. Well, I mean, even before then, people were controlling and manipulating things like fires and were able to use it before it was known exactly what a fire is or how it works.
Yeah, knowledge progresses. It's not static. There's a lot of first you start with know-how on something like that, and then maybe you eventually build a theory and model it. Other things start with theory first and then are discovered. So knowledge is acquiring knowledge is a time-consuming process, but I think it's the way to go.
And that's your primary. This is primarily also by the end of the book. It seems like encouraging or asking astrologers to take that next step beyond the practice to start exploring and trying to formulate a theory of how astrology works and try to find that.
Yeah, to look at other fields. When you're isolated in a bubble, you don't look to anything else. But that's not saying everybody in astrology is like that. I know people in astrology that are involved in other fields of research as well. But that's where cross-fertilization is what you really need to grow something like astrology as a subject. So anyway, I just think that the search for a simplistic answer right now doesn't contribute to growth. It solves a problem pretty quickly and then you're done with it. But I think that, as you point out, my first two chapters are just throwing all this reality up on the table and saying, well, what do we do with this?
Right. Yeah, well, and the book itself ends up becoming partially like your personal reflections and research about after a lifetime worth of research and work in the field of astrology, and I think it's a really major achievement from that standpoint for sure, and was really brilliant. And yeah, I'm really glad that you wrote it. So thanks for writing this
Well, thank
book.
you, Chris. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to. So the title of the book is it's titled "The Nature of Astrology: History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems." It's published by Inner Traditions, which lately has started getting into publishing astrology books, and they're just doing an amazing job publishing a ton of really great books lately. I think I've interviewed like 2 other authors. I interviewed Eric Purdue last year, who did a translation of Agrippa, published yeah. What are your, so people can find it in bookstores, they can order it online on Amazon or anywhere else.
You can order directly from Inner Traditions. I think they give a discount.
Okay, good to know. So just Google Inner Traditions or go to, I think their website is innertraditions.com.
Yeah.
What's next for you, or what you're going to publish any other like 500-page poems, or what's in your plans for the future?
Gotta get my body. I gotta survive. I have had a couple of accidents and 2 spinal surgeries. I have, a cervical myelopathy. And there's a lot that you have to do to maintain it. And it kind of slows you down.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed your Saturn is at 22 Leo on the ascendant to 24 Leo, and your moon, like mine, is in Aquarius. So you've been going through this you've been going through a Saturn opposition recently, and Saturn opposite your ascendant, and before that, starting in 2020, going over your moon. So hopefully that upcoming ingress of Saturn into Pisces and kind of getting out of Aquarius after the last 4 years will help.
Maybe, but you get older, and then you have these slowly degenerating situations.
I want something.
To bring in some Iranian astrology, I have the Sun square Hades, which is deterioration. So I have basically a very slowly deteriorating situation with my spinal cord that needs to be slowed down. And one of the effects is just being dizzy. Having what's called cervical dizziness. So,
Give me a second, love.
you could look at my chart. You could see that health problems are an issue, and they particularly get, with Saturn, they come on when you're older.
Yeah, and you mentioned Uranian astrology is one of your other specialties, and you've also done work on Mesoamerican astrology, Mayan astrology.
Well, Uranian astrology I got into very early. I had Gary Kristen and I kind of got that going, and we knew Hans Niggman. Gary brought me over. Two of us went over to his house one time. We saw him at conferences, and so I learned a lot of Uranian early. Got into ancient astrology early with A.H. Blackwell, back when just pretty much Manilius and Ptolemy and a few fragments was just about all that was known. So I got into that. And then I got interested in Mesoamerican because here was an opportunity to understand how astrology might have originated in an entirely different culture. And so I got into that, wrote on that sensibly. But meanwhile, just practiced kind of a mixture of standard astrology, a few ideas from here and there, old ideas, new ideas, Uranian ideas, and both practicing it.
Well, and it seems like that's giving you a great perspective and amount of depth, especially when you start analyzing the astrological community and the different trends and different things in it in the final chapters of the book that are very perceptive, and just your analysis of those was very on point in terms of things you said about the community and your sort of assessment of the community, as well as your predictions about current trends and where some of that might take us in the future.
Yeah. Well, I hope people get to read it and get something out of it. It's to answer your last question, I mean, this was a big job, and the pandemic helped in a way. The quarantine helped me get it done. But at this point, I'm not sure where to go. I may write some technical papers, but I don't think I could ever do anything like this again. I wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
But some scientific papers, I have a few on ResearchGate and academia.edu. You ever go to those places? People
yeah,
put their
of course.
papers up there. Yeah.
I mean, academia has been amazing over the past decade for making research more accessible
More public,
than it used to be.
I think I have one of your papers in one of my Kepler courses. One I have an online course called Symmetry in Astrology, and I think I have a paper that you wrote on the parts.
Yeah. Theoretical rationale.
Did I get it from academia? Did you have it up there? Or where did I get that from?
Probably,
Maybe
yeah.
the website.
I've posted papers there on academia accounts. That's probably where you got it.
Yeah, so I linked it, and so my students have to read it. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I've got a
It was
book.
public, so I just took it, the link to it. Yeah.
That's fine. I've got a book as well.
I know your book. Yeah, very good
Yeah.
book. Thank you for doing that. Somebody had to do it.
Yeah, well, and I know I need to wrap this up, but that was actually an interesting point, is that you also expressed some reservations about astrological fundamentalism and why you appreciate the looking back into the sources and especially the historical reconstruction of astrology, which is something you've taken advantage of to a certain extent in your book, and a huge chunk of it you also warn against too much fundamentalism and seem kind of nervous about that trend.
Well, I think that there could be a little bit too much of certain things. I mean, there are people that tend to get into, say, Hindu Vedic astrology, right? It becomes their whole world. People get into Hellenistic astrology, and it becomes 100% of their work. I mean, it's okay if you want to do that, but I see it as like a subcategory. And there could be, I always think of my son Bob Zola. We used to go camping and hiking together, and he was always saying, we'd have all these discussions. He'd say, "Oh, the old ways are the good ways."
Right.
And you would do that. And I think that you learn from the past, but it's like, do we want to practice Hippocratic and Galenic medicine in its pure form? I don't think so. There's a lot to be learned from it, but
I don't know what to do.
that, ancient astrology, all kinds of astrology, just needs a lot more testing and sorting out and so on. How well the perfections work. It's a good question. What you do, and I think it's a great thing, is try to flesh out what these people were doing. We have to know what they were doing before we can decide whether the technique works as well and how it's doing it. So somebody's got to do that.
Yeah. One of the things, actually, it's funny about my history review is I got into ancient astrology and studying Hellenistic astrology just like a semester before I started taking your courses back at Kepler. So unfortunately, it's probably one of my regrets in my educational history is I got super into that initial passion of the convert type thing by the time I was studying with you. So I would sometimes be at Kepler reading those translations of the ancient texts instead of focusing on some of the more modern texts that we had moved into at that point, where we were talking about things like secondary progressions or solar arcs or things like that. And I remember some distinct instances like that at symposiums when I was taking some of your classes. So I'm happy in a way that with this book that things have come full circle, and I feel like I've come back around to the position of seeing the value of both ancient and modern astrology.
That might not work though.
And this book has brought me full circle on some other philosophical issues to a certain extent. So I'm happy that how things sort of work out like that.
Yeah, I remember you and George and I were teaching a course on progressions and solar arcs and transits, and you were in and out of it. We asked for permission to, sit in. Nick was giving lectures in the other room or something on the ancient astrology.
On the history of astrology.
Yeah, we trusted you. We said, yeah, go ahead, do what you want to do.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I apologize. I mean, part of the issue was just that I had studied modern astrology for 4 or 5 years.
You seemed to know what you were doing. I mean, we grilled you. You seemed to know what you were doing. So, all right. Fine. Yeah.
Yeah, but
we weren't going to bust your chops. I mean, if you didn't know it, the subject matter, we wouldn't have let you do it.
For sure. Yeah, but you were very gracious about it as I was going through that early stage of being fascinated about traditional astrology.
Yeah.
And and that was the beauty of that stage of Kepler College was, having all these just great lectures and different things at the time of astrologers teaching astrology at a very high level. And I've always felt like I was just super lucky to be the beneficiary of that from people like you, from Rob Hand and Demetra George and Nick Campion and everyone else.
Well, you were at the perfect time to get immersed in ancient astrology. As I mentioned before, I was interested in 20 or 30 years earlier. There just wasn't that much known.
Right.
And then when the three Roberts got together and started, translating it, I mean, that made all the difference. And you were right there when that was happening.
Yeah.
That's,
And then I went and lived there at Project Hindsight for 2 years. That's why I was sort of caught up in all of that. But
great opportunity, really.
Yeah, but I still, drawing from my influence of learning modern astrology and different things from you at Kepler, knew not to go full astrological fundamentalism, and that's why I sort of ended my segment that I did. That it's really important that even though I'm encouraging people to go back and studying ancient astrology, and that there's something valuable to be learned from the past, that astrology is always in a constant state of flux and change, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't synthesize and integrate it with some of the great insights and developments in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of what you've focused on in your work and tried to show the best pieces of is doing a sort of high level modern astrology as an intellectual.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, you got to know your roots. You have to understand where astrology came from. And I credit people digging into the history of astrology with giving astrology the foundation that it had lacked. It was being owned by the historians and the historians of science, and they weren't very friendly. So, it's a very good thing. But in regard to astrological fundamentalism, to me, the coincidence of Project Hindsight, the rise of fundamentalism, taking over the Republican Party, and my own interest in Mesoamerican astrology, they were all at the same time. That's kind of what I'm referring to. I did notice that was happening, that there was this kind of, maybe it had something to do with, the outer planets moving into different signs. Pluto went through Sagittarius and through Capricorn, as a lot of this was happening, but particularly in Sagittarius. You had this rise of fundamentalism, and it seemed to have a little effect on astrology as well, and I was part of that. I mean, there was Project Hindsight was going on at exactly the same time as I was digging into Mesoamerican astrology. Unfortunately, I couldn't communicate in exactly the same way, and I didn't have anybody. No one else was really doing it, but it was the same kind of thing.
That's really interesting because also the focus on Indian astrology.
Indian came in on that too, yeah.
That was all what I saw in retrospective. What I've studied, and I did a paper on this at one point, I think it was in the NCGR journal, was how that coincides with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction in 1982 and 1983. And if you project that back, every time that conjunction happens, you'll see astrologers suddenly doing this thing of looking back into the past and then synthesizing what they find with the contemporary astrology of that time period. And there's a bunch of astrologers like Lilly or Bonatti or other people like that down through history that have gone through similar time periods.
Yeah.
So that seems to be what we're in right now in terms of the synthesis of modern and ancient, and you've made a really great case for integrating some of the modern insights in philosophy and conceptualization and scientific studies that have happened over the past century with all of that ancient wisdom that's been revived relatively recently.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, hey, I got to thank you for allowing me to articulate some of the details. Because there are some things in my book that could be misunderstood if people didn't read it thoroughly or didn't read all of it. But you've allowed me to, clarify where I'm coming from, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today in this 3-hour episode. So we'll wrap it up. But I encourage people to read the book. I tried to get as much in as I could. I just finished reading this 10 minutes before we started, and there's so much more there. So I definitely recommend people checking it out because we've only skimmed the surface of some of the great things. I know my friend Nick Diggin-Best, who read this and really liked it, he was telling me to ask you about a couple of figures. We're not going to go into it, but maybe a follow-up episode about John H. Nelson, for example, or Edward R. Dewey, and some of their work studying
Cycles,
celestial cycles and how that's actually shown up. Maybe we can save that for another episode.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. I'm just staying right here.
Okay, good. All right. Well, great job on the book. Thanks a lot for writing it again, and yeah, thanks for joining me today.
Welcome. You're quite welcome. Thank you too.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see